The afternoon sun hung heavy over a small Louisiana town in the summer of 1961, the kind of humid heat that made the air itself feel thick enough to touch. On a quiet street corner sat a modest little shop, its hand-painted sign reading, "Boudreaux Shoe Repair," in letters slightly faded by years of sun and rain. On this particular afternoon, a small crowd had gathered on the sidewalk outside, watching in uneasy silence as two men carried the shop's belongings out onto the curb. Work tables, tools, half-finished pairs of shoes still clamped in their stands. In the middle of it all sat a blind man, perfectly still on an overturned crate, his weathered hands folded in his lap, his face composed despite the quiet humiliation unfolding around him. Nobody on that street expected a stranger passing through town that day to pull his car over, or to change absolutely everything before the afternoon was over. What that stranger did next wasn't really about the money, though the money mattered plenty. It was about a man who understood, more deeply than most, exactly what it felt like to lose the one thing that made you feel like you still mattered in the world. Before we get into it, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching this from. I always love reading those. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's a great time, because we bring you stories just like this one every single week. All right, let's get back to that street corner in Louisiana. Samuel Boudreaux was 54 years old, and for more than 30 of those years, he had run the small shoe repair shop that bore his family's name. He'd lost his sight at the age of 9, the result of a childhood fever that no doctor in the parish could fully explain, and for the rest of his life, he had refused to let that loss define the boundaries of what he could accomplish. His father, a shoemaker himself, had taught him the trade with patient, deliberate care, understanding intuitively that Samuel's hands would need to learn what his eyes never could. The precise pressure of a stitch, the exact angle of a heel, the subtle differences in leather grain that most sighted craftsmen never bothered to notice because they simply looked instead of felt. By the time his father passed, Samuel had already surpassed him in skill, his reputation quietly spreading through the parish as the man who could repair a pair of boots so precisely you'd swear they'd never been damaged at all. He ran the shop entirely alone, navigating the small space with the practiced ease of someone who had long ago memorized every inch of it, the exact number of steps from the front counter to his workbench, the precise location of every tool in its designated spot, the particular creak of the third floorboard near the door that told him exactly when a customer had entered before the bell above the door even finished ringing. His independence was, in many ways, the core of his identity. He refused help carrying supplies, refused assistance crossing the street, even from well-meaning neighbors, refused any hint of pity that occasionally crept into a customer's voice when they first realized he couldn't see them. His blindness, to him, was simply an obstacle he had already conquered decades ago, and he had little patience for anyone who treated it as some ongoing tragedy requiring special accommodation. In town, he was well respected, not out of charity or sympathy, but out of genuine admiration for his craft. Regular customers brought their boots and shoes to him even when cheaper options existed, understanding that Samuel's work would outlast anything mass-produced. A young boy named Marcus, no older than 12, had taken to visiting the shop most afternoons after school, sweeping the floors and organizing supplies in exchange for Samuel teaching him small elements of the trade, an arrangement that had grown, over the past year, into something resembling an informal apprenticeship. Life, for Samuel, had settled into a rhythm of quiet dignity and purposeful work, until the past several months, when that rhythm began, slowly but unmistakably, to fall apart. The trouble had started, as these things often did, gradually enough that Samuel hadn't fully registered the severity of it until it was nearly too late. A new shoe factory outlet had opened on the edge of town roughly 8 months earlier, offering mass-produced repairs and cheap replacement shoes at prices Samuel simply couldn't compete with, regardless of the superior quality of his own work. Customers who had once brought him their finest leather boots for careful, meticulous repair began, one by one, drifting toward the cheaper, faster alternative, understanding perhaps on some level that they were sacrificing quality for convenience, but unable to justify the price difference regardless. Samuel's income, steady for decades, began to shrink month by month, and for the first time in over 30 years of running the shop, he found himself falling behind on rent. His pride, the very quality that had carried him through decades of proving himself capable despite his blindness, now became his greatest obstacle. He told no one about his situation. Not Marcus, not his regular customers, not even the elderly widow 2 doors down who'd known him since childhood and would likely have helped in whatever small way she could if she'd known the truth. He simply worked harder, staying at his workbench late into the night, taking on extra mending jobs at reduced rates just to keep some money coming in, refusing to lower the quality of his craftsmanship even as his customers increasingly couldn't afford to pay him what the work was truly worth. His landlord, Mr. Devereaux, a practical and increasingly impatient man, had sent 2 formal warnings about the overdue rent, each one met with Samuel's calm assurance that he simply needed a little more time. But time, as it turned out, wasn't enough. The gap between what Samuel earned and what he owed continued to widen, no matter how many extra hours he poured into his workbench, no matter how many nights he sat alone in his shop long after dark, his fingers working leather by memory and touch, while his mind quietly calculated numbers that simply refused to balance. John Wayne found himself passing through Louisiana that summer for reasons more personal than professional. An old friend from his early years, a fellow veteran he'd served alongside decades earlier, had settled in the region after the war, and Duke had promised more than once over the years to visit properly rather than simply exchanging occasional letters. The drive gave him time to think, something increasingly rare in the whirlwind pace his career had taken on in recent years. By 1961, Duke's fame had grown to heights that occasionally still caught him off guard, and yet the lessons instilled in him over a decade earlier, on that dusty Texas ranch under Cole Hardin's patient, unyielding instruction, remained as present in his daily thinking as they'd ever been. Real strength doesn't need an audience. That single truth had shaped not just his approach to acting, but his approach to the quiet moments of struggle he encountered throughout his travels, moments most people, caught up in their own lives, simply drove past without a second thought. Duke had developed, over the years, an almost instinctive habit of noticing these moments, an awareness of the quiet dignity people carried even in their hardest circumstances, and an equally instinctive discomfort with simply continuing on his way once he'd noticed. It wasn't guilt exactly, nor some performative need to prove his own goodness. It was simply the accumulated weight of every lesson he'd absorbed since that ranch, that the measure of a man lay not in grand, public gestures, but in the countless small, unseen choices made when no one was watching, when no credit would ever be given, when the only witness to your character was yourself. Duke's car rolled slowly down the main street of the small Louisiana town, windows down against the thick summer heat, when he noticed the small crowd gathered on the sidewalk ahead. He slowed instinctively, some old habit of observation kicking in before he'd even consciously decided to pay attention. As he drew closer, the scene came into focus with startling clarity. 2 men were carrying furniture and tools out of a small shop, stacking them haphazardly on the curb, while a well-dressed man stood nearby, arms crossed. watching the process with the detached efficiency of someone completing a routine task, rather than upending another person's entire livelihood. Sitting on an overturned wooden crate near the shop's entrance was a blind man, his hands folded calmly in his lap, his face composed despite what was clearly a deeply humiliating public spectacle. Duke pulled his car to the side of the road, cutting the engine, watching the scene unfold with a growing tightness in his chest. The blind man made no move to protest, no visible distress beyond the subtle tension in his shoulders, sitting with the kind of stillness that Duke recognized instantly, not resignation, but a fierce, private refusal to let anyone see him break. The crowd murmured amongst themselves, sympathetic glances exchanged, but no one stepped forward to intervene. The collective paralysis of bystanders, unsure whether it was their place to interfere in what was, technically, a legal eviction over unpaid rent. Duke sat in his car a moment longer, watching the well-dressed landlord check his pocket watch impatiently as his men continued removing the shop's contents, piece by piece, onto the growing pile at the curb. Duke stepped out of his car, not rushing, not drawing unnecessary attention to himself, simply walking with quiet purpose toward the gathered crowd. A young boy stood near the edge of the sidewalk, watching the scene with visible distress, his hands clenched into small fists at his sides. Duke approached him first, crouching slightly to speak at eye level. "What's happening here, son?" The boy, Marcus, looked up at him with wide, worried eyes. "That's Mr. Samuel's shop. Best shoemaker in the whole parish. The landlord's putting him out. Says he's behind on rent." Duke nodded slowly, processing the information while his eyes drifted back toward the blind man still seated calmly on his crate, amid the chaos of his own displaced belongings. "He run that shop alone?" Duke asked. Marcus nodded vigorously. "Yes, sir, 30 years, my pa says. Blind since he was a boy, but you'd never know it watching him work. Best boots in town come out of that shop." Duke studied Samuel from a distance a moment longer, noting the way the man's head tilted slightly at each new sound around him, tracking the movement of his belongings being carried away with a precision that suggested he was keenly aware of everything happening, despite his inability to see any of it directly. There was something in his stillness, his refusal to show public distress despite what must have been overwhelming humiliation, that struck Duke with familiar recognition. The same quiet strength he'd witnessed in an elderly widow counting coins 2 years earlier. The same dignity Cole Hardin had first taught him to recognize and respect over a decade before that. Duke made his way toward Samuel directly, moving carefully to avoid startling him, his footsteps deliberately audible against the pavement. "Mind if I sit with you a moment?" he asked, his voice calm and unhurried. Samuel turned his head slightly toward the sound, his expression guarded but not unkind. "Free country, I suppose, even for a man about to lose his shop." Duke lowered himself onto the curb nearby, giving Samuel space rather than crowding him. "Heard you've run this place a long while." 31 years, Samuel said, a note of quiet pride slipping through despite the circumstances. "Learned the trade from my father, right in that very shop. Built half those tools with my own hands over the years." He gestured vaguely toward the pile of belongings now stacked haphazardly at the curb, his composure cracking slightly for the first time. "Nothing fancy about it. Just good, honest work." Duke listened carefully, understanding intuitively that Samuel needed to talk more than he needed to be consoled. "New factory outlet opened up a while back," Samuel continued, his tone hardening slightly. "Undercut my prices something fierce. Couldn't compete. Not without cutting corners I refuse to cut. Fell behind on rent for the first time in my whole life." He paused, his jaw tightening. "Man works 31 years, proves himself capable 1,000 times over, despite what people expect from someone who can't see. And it still comes down to this. Sitting on a crate on the sidewalk like some charity case, everyone watching, waiting to see if I'll break down." Duke's voice remained steady, careful not to offer the pity Samuel so clearly despised. "Doesn't look like breaking's much in your nature." Samuel's expression shifted slightly, something like grudging respect passing across his face. "No," he said quietly. "Never has been. But it's not really about the shop. Not entirely. It's about what happens after. Man loses his independence, loses the one thing that made him more than just the blind fellow everyone has to look after. 31 years I proved I didn't need anybody's help. Now look at me." The weight of that statement settled heavily between them, and Duke found himself understanding, with sudden and profound clarity, that this wasn't simply about unpaid rent. It was about an entire lifetime of hard-won dignity hanging in the balance. Duke excused himself a short while later, walking a short distance down the block to gather his thoughts, the humid Louisiana air thick around him as he considered what he'd just witnessed. Cole Hardin's voice echoed in his memory, as it so often did in moments like this. Real confidence doesn't announce itself. It just holds its ground. Samuel had held his ground for 31 years through sheer force of will and skill. And Duke understood instinctively that simply handing him money, however well-intentioned, risked undoing the very independence Samuel had fought so hard to protect. He thought of Eleanor 2 years earlier, and the careful, indirect way he'd resolved her situation without ever compromising her pride. The same principle applied here, though the specifics would require careful thought. Samuel didn't need charity. He needed his shop back, his independence restored, his ability to continue proving, to himself if no one else, that he remained entirely capable of standing on his own. Duke resolved that whatever he did next would need to preserve that fundamental truth above all else.
Duke approached Devereaux directly, finding him consulting a clipboard near his car as his men finished loading the last of Samuel's belongings. "Got a moment?" Duke asked. Devereaux glanced up, mild irritation flickering across his face at the interruption. "If it's about the Shoemaker, my mind's made up. Man's 3 months behind, and I've already got a new tenant lined up for next week." "How much does he owe?" Duke asked, his tone calm but direct. Devereaux hesitated, clearly caught off guard by the question. "Why is it your concern?" "I'd like to settle it," Duke said simply. "In full, in cash, right now." Devereaux studied him for a long moment, clearly weighing the unexpected offer against his existing arrangements. "Already told the new tenant the space is available," he said, though his tone had softened considerably. "I'll make it worth the inconvenience," Duke said, reaching for his wallet. "Full back rent, plus enough to smooth things over with whoever else you promised the space to. But I need his belongings returned today. The shop reopened before evening, and he's never to know who settled it." Devereaux's eyebrows rose. "You know this man?" "Not particularly," Duke admitted. "But I know what 31 years of honest work is worth, and I know what it costs a man to lose it over a few months of bad luck." Devereaux studied him a moment longer, curiosity playing on his face. "Can I ask who you are?" Duke offered only a small, unreadable smile. "Just someone passing through who'd rather see this resolved quietly." After a long pause, Devereaux extended his hand, the cash already changing hands between them. "You've got yourself a deal." Wouldn't have expected a stranger to care this much about a shoemaker he just met. "Sometimes strangers understand each other better than folks who've known each other years," Duke replied, before turning to instruct the men to begin carrying Samuel's belongings back inside. Samuel remained seated on his crate throughout the exchange, unable to see what was transpiring, but keenly aware of the shifting sound around him. Footsteps moving in the opposite direction now. The scrape of his workbench being carried back to the shop's entrance rather than away from it. Confusion mixed with cautious hope as Devereaux approached him directly. Situation's been resolved, Samuel. Your things are going back inside. Shop's yours, same as before. Samuel's brow furrowed deeply. Resolved how? I don't have the money. Devereaux, you know that as well as I do. Not my place to explain further, Devereaux said, his earlier impatience replaced by something almost sheepish. Just know it's handled. Rent's covered for now. Before Samuel could press further, Marcus came running up, breathless with excitement. Mr. Samuel, they're bringing everything back. All your tools, your workbench, everything. Samuel sat in stunned silence for a long moment, his usual composure cracking slightly under the weight of confusion and overwhelming relief. He rose slowly, allowing Marcus to guide him back toward the shop's entrance, his hands immediately reaching out to confirm what his ears were telling him. The familiar shape of his workbench, the precise location of his tools, everything restored exactly as it had been that morning. That evening, alone in his shop after Marcus had finally gone home, Samuel sat quietly at his workbench, running his fingers over the familiar grain of the leather scraps scattered across its surface. Overwhelmed by a swirl of emotions he couldn't fully untangle. Relief, confusion, and beneath it all, a persistent, nagging question about who exactly had intervened on his behalf and why. Over the following days, Samuel found himself unable to simply accept the mystery and move forward. Despite his usual pragmatic nature, he asked Marcus, who knew nothing beyond what he'd witnessed that afternoon. He asked his regular customers, who offered only rumors and speculation. Some claimed it was a wealthy relative Samuel had never mentioned. Others suggested Devereaux himself had simply had a change of heart, though Samuel found that particular theory difficult to believe given the landlord's characteristically businesslike demeanor. What lingered most persistently in Samuel's memory was a brief exchange he'd nearly forgotten in the chaos of that afternoon. A stranger who had sat beside him on the curb, spoken with him plainly and without pity, asked careful questions about his craft and his history, then disappeared sometime during confusion of his belongings being returned. He remembered the voice clearly, calm, unhurried, carrying a quiet weight that seemed at odds with the stranger's evident youth. He found himself replaying that brief conversation repeatedly, turning it over in his mind, though logic told him it seemed unlikely that a passing stranger would involve himself so deeply in the affairs of a man he'd just met. Several weeks later, Duke found himself once again passing to the same stretch of Louisiana, his visit with his old war buddy concluding, his route home taking him conveniently past the same small town. He hadn't planned to return to Samuel's shop specifically, but as he drove past a familiar street corner, something compelled him to stop. He entered the shop under the simple pretense of needing a boot repaired, the bell above the door announcing his arrival. Samuel looked up from his workbench, his expression shifting almost immediately from polite professional courtesy to something more alert, more focused. "That voice," Samuel said slowly, setting down his tools. "I know that voice." Duke remained quiet for a moment, neither confirming nor denying, allowing Samuel space to work through his own realization. "You're the one who sat with me that afternoon," Samuel continued, his tone careful, testing. "Asked about my father, about the trade. Same afternoon, everything got resolved mysteriously, without a word of explanation from anyone." Duke offered a measured response, careful not to confirm outright, while equally unwilling to lie directly. Strange how these things work out sometimes. Samuel's expression remained thoughtful, searching. "Strange indeed," he said quietly, "that a stranger would care enough to sit with a blind shoemaker on the worst afternoon of his professional life, ask him about his craft, and then disappear right around the time his troubles mysteriously vanished." He paused, his sightless eyes somehow conveying a piercing, knowing intensity despite their inability to see. "You wouldn't happen to know anything more about that, would you?" Duke considered his response carefully, understanding that Samuel's pride, so similar in nature to his own instincts around quiet generosity, deserved honesty in its own particular form, honesty that respected both men's need for the truth to remain unspoken directly. "I know that whoever helped you probably understood something about what it means to lose the thing that makes you feel like you still matter," Duke said quietly, and probably understood, too, that a man like you wouldn't want a name attached to it. Would likely feel it complicated things, made the help feel more like charity than it needed to. Samuel absorbed this for a long moment, a slow, understanding smile spreading across his weathered face. "You're not confirming anything," he said, "nor denying it," Duke replied evenly. "Seems to me some things are better left exactly where they are." Samuel nodded slowly, seeming to accept this unspoken arrangement with the same quiet dignity that had defined his entire life. "Man values his independence the way I do," Samuel said. "Understands better than most why someone else might value there's enough to stay anonymous about a kindness." He paused, reaching beneath his workbench for a small, carefully wrapped package. "I don't know your name, and I suspect you'd rather I didn't learn it. But I know what my hands are capable of, even if my eyes aren't. Made these the past few weeks. Hoping you might come back through." He extended the package toward Duke, who unwrapped it carefully to find a pair of meticulously crafted leather boots, stitched with the same precision and care that had built Samuel's reputation over 3 decades. "A craftsman's way of saying thank you," Samuel said simply, without needing to say the words directly. Duke accepted the gift with genuine, quiet emotion, understanding profound weight behind the gesture. Not simply gratitude, but Samuel's own way of restoring balance, of ensuring exchange between them remained one of mutual respect rather than one-sided charity. In the month that followed, Samuel's shop slowly began to recover, word spreading to the parish of his continued fine craftsmanship, despite the competition from the factory outlet down the road. Customers who value quality over convenience returned, understanding now more than ever the value of work done by hands that had spent decades perfecting their craft. Samuel began taking his mentorship of Marcus more seriously, teaching him not just the technical elements of shoemaking, but the deeper values that had carried him through his own hardest years. Patience, pride in one's work, and the quiet dignity of never asking for more than you'd earned, while remaining humbly grateful for the rare, unexpected kindness that occasionally crossed your path regardless. The ripple continued outward in small, unseen ways throughout the community, much as it had in that small Texas town 2 years earlier, though few beyond Samuel and Duke themselves would ever understand the full connection between these quiet, unrelated acts of generosity scattered across different states and different lives. John Wayne drove away from that small Louisiana town with a pair of handcrafted boots resting carefully on the passenger seat beside him, a physical reminder of a lesson he'd already understood deeply, but which Samuel had somehow managed to teach him anew. That true independence and true generosity weren't opposites, but rather two expressions of the same fundamental dignity. Cole Hardin had taught him, decades earlier, that real strength never needed an audience to prove itself real. Samuel Boudreau, in his own quiet way, had taught him something equally profound, that receiving help graciously, without losing one's sense of self, required its own particular kind of courage. Somewhere in that small Louisiana parish, a blind shoemaker continued his work exactly as he had for over 3 decades, his hands moving with the same practiced precision, his shop filled once again with the familiar sounds and smells that had defined his entire life's purpose. And somewhere on the open road, a quiet stranger continued his own journey, carrying forward the same lesson he'd first learned on a Texas ranch over a decade earlier, that the truest measure of a man lies not in what he demands the world recognize, but in what he's willing to give without ever needing anyone to know his name. If you enjoyed this story, hit like, and I'll see you in the next one.